The Heceta Head Lighthouse is a story about a tiny community living on a rugged, windswept hillside overlooking the sea on the Oregon coast. It's a story about a primitive, isolated existence, all centered on one vital purpose: that when the sun goes down, the light will always be there to guide the ships. The very beginning of the project to build the lighthouse began in 1891 in Washington, D.C., when President Benjamin Harrison signed the order passed by Congress. The lighthouse was completed in 1894 and named after a Portuguese navigator, Bruno de Heceta, who had noted shallow water in his log when sailing past here in 1775. The lighthouse has what's called a first-order lens, which is the largest size. It was manufactured by Chance Brothers of England and fashioned after a design by Auguste Jean Fresnel, which is known as the Fresnel lens. Auguste Fresnel managed to obtain circularly polarized light using obtuse angles of 126 degrees and acute angles of 54 degrees, which focused the light into a powerful beam that could reach 21 miles out to sea. The lens was originally turned by a mechanism similar to a grandfather clock, only much larger. It had a 200-pound weight suspended on the end of a cable, and after being hand-cranked up to the top, the weight would slowly descend while turning the clockwork that turned the lens. The cable, with the weight attached to its end, was suspended down the center of the spiral staircase that runs from the bottom to the top of the lighthouse. As a result, the lighthouse keeper had to climb the stairs every 4 hours to crank the weight back up to the top. And he had to carry kerosene from one of the 2 oil storage buildings to the top of the lighthouse, where it was poured into a reservoir for the lamp that made the light for the Fresnel lens. The lighthouse keepers lived in a large Queen Anne-style house located a few hundred yards down the hillside. The families that lived there had very little contact with the outside world. They grew their own vegetables, had their own school for the children, and were as self-sufficient as possible, due to the almost impassable road that led to the closest town 12 miles away. Until the 1930s, the first assistant and second assistant lighthouse keepers and their families were the ones who lived here. The basic floor plan hasn't changed much, looking about the same as it did in the 1800s. There are 2 winding staircases on opposite ends of the house, 2 living rooms with 2 identical fireplaces. However, there has been some renovation, with the biggest change occurring when indoor plumbing was installed. One thing that hasn't seemed to change over time is a legend of a resident ghost named Rue that has been reported to occasionally be seen looking out this window toward the lighthouse. You can see from these historical photos that this had been a small community with other buildings and another house. This house, that is no longer there, was the one that was always occupied by the principal lighthouse keeper and his family. When the lighthouse began using electricity in the 1930s, it eliminated one of the lighthouse keeper positions. As a result, this house was sold for $10 and torn down, and the lumber hauled to Mapleton, a small town on the banks of the Siuslaw River. The lumber was used to build the Alphabet Cafe and Bookstore. Here is proprietor Carolyn Estes explaining how the lumber was used.
Where the structural part of the building was built with the lumber from the lighthouse keeper's house, and now all you can see in the inside is the big beam that goes across the major part of the building.
The other remaining house was a duplex, so both the principal lighthouse keeper and the remaining assistant lighthouse keeper and their families lived in it. These are the residents of the two houses from around 1912. The men in uniform, starting from the left, are Second Assistant Frank DeRoy, the First Assistant William Smith, and Principal Lighthouse Keeper Olaf Hansen. For the children, a significant part of their day would have been spent studying in this rather rustic-looking schoolhouse with their teacher Paul Goodwin. And this is the class of 1916 with a different teacher, Mrs. Ballard. Out of the 14 students in attendance, 5 of them are Olaf Hansen's daughters. For their leisure time, every spare minute was playing on or exploring the beach. Sometimes they went to community picnics that were attended by the Stonefield family that lived in a house built on the hillside above Cape Cove. Their house served as a Heceta Head schoolhouse for a time. The man on the left is Second Assistant Lighthouse Keeper Frank DeRoy, who had spent most of his life as a seafaring man. He was transferred and promoted to First Assistant at the Lime Kill Lighthouse in Puget Sound in 1917. In 1920, he returned to Heceta Head as Principal Lighthouse Keeper when Olaf Hansen was transferred. Frank DeRoy did more to put the lighthouse in top condition than any of the other lighthouse keepers that served before or after him. As a result of his efforts, the Heceta Head Lighthouse received the coveted Gold Star Award shortly after he had been transferred to the Columbia River Station. Even though he wasn't at the presentation, the award was made in recognition of his contributions at Heceta Head. Not long after Frank DeRoy came to Heceta Head the first time, he married Jenny Gustafson. She had immigrated from Sweden as a child, growing up in Oakland, California. For Jenny, her arrival at Heceta Head was somewhat of a culture shock because of the primitive surroundings. She soon adapted, and she was instrumental in making positive changes to the interior of the house. Jenny didn't like the stark white walls, so she painted them pastel colors. And she convinced her husband to purchase white and blue check linoleum for the bathroom and the kitchen. This shows her, quite a few years later, posing for a photo in one of the rooms she redecorated. One of the things that contributed to the isolation for these people was not having a suitable place to build a dock. Supplies had to be brought to the beach by rowboat. Shipping their food and other materials was done by a small freighter called the USS Rose. They were offloaded to a small boat that was rowed to shore. Receiving these shipments on the beach could only be done in good weather. In winter, when the road was impassable and the sea was rough, the delivery of supplies could be cut off completely until things improved. In the early days, horses were used exclusively for transportation by everyone. It was normal to ride horseback or use the animals to pull a buggy or a freight wagon. In this photograph, the lighthouse keeper has his belongings loaded on a wagon, and he's getting ready to leave for a new assignment. The beach was used extensively as a road during low tide. There was even regular stagecoach runs by companies such as this one called the Beach Stage Line that ran between Marshfield and the town of Drain. And there was this company called Bartlett Stage and Freight that ran between Florence and Reedsport. Even early automobiles used the beach for commerce, like the Walport to Yachats mail run. To make room for passengers, it appears the mail sacks were simply tied onto the car wherever they could find room. There were some hardy souls that did occasionally manage to drive their automobile to the lighthouse, but they were continually getting stuck and having to be pulled out with horses. The need to improvise was an ongoing challenge, as evidenced here by chains on the rear tires for traction, and using rocks placed in front of the wheels for parking brakes. The road continued past the lighthouse, going north to the small town of Yachats. This is a car in that stretch of road, and you can see it's not much more than a trail. These transportation problems all changed in 1930 when construction began on the Roosevelt Highway, which cut through the foreground a short distance this side of the new schoolhouse. In April of 1931, John K. Holt, the major contractor for the Cape Creek Bridge, arrived. Eventually, he employed between 35 and 50 men, and with those hired by other companies, brought the total closer to 90 workers on the project. The majority of the laborers earned 50 cents per hour for a 6-hour day. Many of them brought their wives and children to live with them in the construction camp, which completely overwhelmed the tiny schoolhouse. This scaffolding is being built to help erect the bridge over Cape Creek, a small stream that empties into the bay next to the lighthouse. And here is that same bridge nearly complete, with most of the scaffolding still in place. The 220-foot span was completed on March 31st of 1932 at a cost of $150,000. On the south end of the bridge was an almost vertical hillside into which this test hole was dug to begin work on the tunnel to connect with the road on the other side of the hill. Throughout the construction period, the public's interest was very intense, to the point where sightseers were getting in the way of truck drivers working on the project. This is one of the large earth movers that was used by the crew working on the tunnel, moving rock out of the tunnel to be hauled away by the trucks. One of the equipment operators that loaded many of the trucks while cutting the roadbed was William Lindley. He moved to the nearby town of Cushman and brought his wife Margaret and their children. The children's names, starting from the right, is Alan, then cousin Lois, Dorothy, and then Melvin. This is Dorothy, the little girl in a stocking hat, 76 years later.
When I was 3 years old, we lived in Cushman, a few miles from Florence. My dad got a job helping to build Highway 101 that runs by the lighthouse, and he ran a drag line that cut out the roadbed.
William Lindley's sister Flora married a man named Ernie Funk, the son of Oscar Funk, one of the original lighthouse contractors. This is a photo around 25 years earlier showing Oscar Funk and his wife Laura and their 2 daughters, Alma and Frida, along with their young son Ernie, who would eventually marry William Lindley's sister. Oscar Funk, pictured with his wife Laura, immigrated from Germany in 1883 and set up a metalworking shop at the small town of Seaton, located about 20 miles inland from the coast. Oscar Funk's metalwork was an example of fine craftsmanship, and its quality and beauty is still apparent over 115 years later. The tunnel was completed in December of 1931, and the bridge was finished 3 months later on March 31st of 1932. This new Roosevelt Highway was at first only a gravel surface. Eventually, the funding was approved for asphalt. The opening of this part of the coast to quick, easy access not only stimulated new business, it also created a literal stampede of tourism. Gone were the days of isolation and the need for self-sufficiency. What this small community now faced was a lack of privacy and the sobering realization that game regulations could no longer be conveniently overlooked. Nearly 8 years later, Heceta Head saw a flood of visitors increase even more when the National Guard moved in with their tents and equipment during World War II for the purpose of guarding the beaches between Yachats and Heceta Beach north of Florence. About 75 men were stationed here. Only 2 civilians remained, the lighthouse keeper and his wife, Cap and Ma Herman. Cap was a good-humored, grandfatherly type who refused to take a military commission for his service during the war. Just as running the lighthouse with electricity reduced the need for lighthouse keepers, so did electronic navigation reduce the need for the lighthouse as a navigational aid. There is one valuable aspect of the lighthouse that continues to increase. That's tourism and the privilege of being able to see and touch an important part of Oregon history. such as this stone the boys are playing on that had been placed there to help ladies disembark from the carriages pulled by horses. These remnants of our past, found in a place that is both rugged and beautiful, has made the Heceta Head Lighthouse into one of Oregon's primary tourist destinations. Aside from the history and scenic beauty, visitors now find daily tours, a gift shop, and accommodations, as the lighthouse keeper's house is now a bed and breakfast. It is also a very popular place for weddings. This young couple came all the way from Manhattan to say their wedding vows in front of the lighthouse as the sun goes down over the Pacific Ocean. Just as so many people who came to this place over the past 115 years, generations of lighthouse keepers and their families, construction workers and their families, and all of the others that have called the Heceta Head Lighthouse home, now Cammie and Richard are making memories that will last a lifetime.